Thank you very much, and thanks to all of the members and delegates who've sacrificed a lunch hour to come and listen to an economist. Wow. So you get extra points for bravery in that regard. I don't know what the weather's like where you are, but if it was sunny outside and the choice was, a nice walk at lunchtime or listening to an economist, that would not be a difficult choice. They say an economist is someone who's good with numbers but didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So that's just kind of my fair warning, my safe harbor statement. You all know all about safe harbor statements. Working in the super industry, that's my safe harbor statement. But I'm a union economist, so in that regard, I'm not your typical economist. There's some in the Liberal Party and the Murdoch press who would say union economist is a contradiction in terms, like jumbo shrimp or military intelligence or something like that. But I actually think that in the union movement, we can use economics on our side to empower our arguments and empower our members so that they understand what we do and know that we're doing it actually not just to make our individual members better off, and they are better off by being in a union, but actually to make our economy and our society better off. And in that regard, I think we can use economics for us instead of against us. That's part of my mission through the Center for Future Work. So I'm going to share a few slides for illustrating my talk. Mandy, give me the thumbs up if you see the title slide okay there. Great stuff. Why unions matter, understanding the economic benefits of collective bargaining and enterprise agreements, so that as your team enters this very important round of bargaining, as Nicole indicated, know that you've got, in a way, an extra responsibility, because Australia is still trying to recover from the COVID pandemic and the recession that came with it. And believe me, unions and the role that unions play are more important now than at any other time. In fact, it is during tough times that workers need a strong union at their back. It's fine during good times for unions to go out and try to share the wealth, but it's in bad times that we have to hang on to what we've won in the past, protect our standards and our benchmarks, and then prepare ourselves to make more progress when we can. And in that regard, this round of bargaining is going to be critical for you. That's our website at the center, and all of our research is open access there. That's my Twitter handle and the center's Twitter handle. You're welcome to join the conversation, including tweeting from this presentation if you like. That's fine. It seems to me that the other side, the employers and the conservative governments, always try to use economics against us. And that's why, I'm proud of what I do as a union economist. I'm a union member as well. I'm a member of the ASU, that's our sector in the research world. And I'm proud to say the Center for Future Work has 100% density. So that's how it should be, which is funny for me because I'm the director as well. So when we have bargaining, I have to kind of jump between one side of the table and the other side of the table all the time as we're doing it. Not really, but we can use economics to support our cases for better wages and conditions, for more secure jobs, for a better sharing of the wealth. They say every time we ask for something, whether it's in the workplace or in our community or to protect the environment, they say it's not economically feasible, it's not economically viable, it's not fiscally sustainable. But they have a very narrow and one-sided and very politicized idea of economics. And this is where I think unions have to, in a way, take the offensive. And that starts first and foremost with asking a very fundamental question. What is the economy about anyway? Most people get dazed and confused. Their eyes glaze over with the quarterly GDP statistics or the financial tables, or someone like the guy who comes on TV every night to tell you about the ups and downs of the stock market. And they think it's very mathematical. They think it's very technical. They think it's very financial, and therefore it has nothing to do with them. And that's absolutely wrong. The reality is the economy starts with the actual work, the productive human labor. It is a four-letter word after all, okay? And it feels like a four-letter word on Monday mornings when we have to get out of bed and go off to do our jobs and earning a living and pay the bills and hope that there's something left at the end of the month for us and our family. And the gross domestic product of our economy literally is the sum total of the value added from all those people doing those jobs, whether they're got university degrees or just high school, whether they work in the public sector or the private sector, whether they produce goods or whether they produce services. All of them are using their brains and their brawn to produce useful goods and services, and that's actually what the economy is. That's where value added comes from. Literally, we start with planet Earth that we're lucky enough to live on, and we better start treating it with a bit more respect. And we harvest what we can from Earth, the gifts of nature, the resources, the air and the water and minerals and forests and agriculture that we need. And then from that point on, all the value in our economy is produced by people who work, who use their brawn, their ability to do physical labor, their brains, their ability to conceptualize and solve problems and communicate. And that is what drives the economy. That literally is. And I find that just that very simple turning the lens around and saying, no, it isn't about the big money. It isn't about the wheelers and dealers. It's actually about the people who work for a living, because that's where the value added comes from. Immediately starts to empower our members with a sense that they have a legitimate and important role in the economy, and they have a legitimate and important say in the economy. Because work is the central productive input to everything that happens in the economy every day. And our prosperity ultimately depends not on balancing the budget, not on getting inflation under control, not on cutting taxes, not on being competitive. Our prosperity totally depends on, can we put more people to work, and then can we assist them to make their work better, to be more productive, to produce higher quality, and to produce new and innovative goods and services, and then use the fruits of their labor, the goods and services that they've produced, to improve their living standards and our living standards in our community and the standards in the environment. That's exactly what the economy is. Nothing more, nothing less. Nothing fancy. It doesn't have to have math involved. It's about your members and their families and other workers doing their jobs to produce value added. And in that regard, we have an essential, central role in the economy. We are not disposable. We are not fringe players. We're not something that can be downsized out of existence. They need us. The economy needs us, because without us, there is no economy. Now, this transfers right into a very interesting discussion about wages, because, of course, wages are going to be one of the big issues on the table when you go into your bargaining. And they're not the only issue. Union members are concerned about all kinds of things, not just wages, but they're an important issue. And this is where, in a way, the stereotype that unions are just out for themselves, they just want to fatten their own wallets, they don't care about anything else, and they're going to screw up the economy when they do that. That's where this mythology reaches a peak, is anytime we start to talk about wages. And of course, employers in general would prefer to pay less rather than more. This is especially true in private sector for-profit enterprises, because if the owner can pay less, that means he or she gets more at the end of the day. But it's even true in nonprofit organizations like CBUS, which naturally the people at the top are looking at how their budgets add up. They're also tending, unfortunately, to compare themselves and mimic what they see happening in the private sector. And so in that regard, there's a natural inclination to say, I want to pay less, not more. Here's the contradiction. Wages are a cost to business, but they're also the revenue, the main source of income for households. 2/3 of all personal primary income comes from wages and salaries. And households, by the way, are the biggest source of spending power in the whole economy. So businesses also want to sell their product. So they can't have it both ways. They can't say, I want to pay less, but I want to sell the product to someone, unless they think they're going to sell the product to people who live on Mars or something like that. Because the reality is households need that wage income in order to buy back the goods and services that they produced. And there's a kind of a seed of irrationality embedded within the private competitive economy, whereby individual businesses want to do something that, if they all succeeded, namely suppressing wages and keeping them down, they would all be hurt by. It's a kind of collective irrationality, if you like. So this is as complicated as you have to get in economics. Workers get the money, and then workers spend the money. In fact, thanks to the miracle of credit, sometimes they spend it before they get it, okay? So, and that is literally what makes the economy go around. When workers are able to negotiate higher wages, and That is a hard thing to do these days, as I will show you. That translates into higher consumer purchasing power, and workers in general spend pretty well every penny that they get. Their super, of course, is their main source of pension savings. And beyond that, most households literally spend every penny that they get. So higher wages translates into more spending. More spending means there's more market for the goods and services that businesses produce, which means they increase their production, which means they hire people. And that hiring, in turn, supports stronger labor market conditions that allow for still higher wages. So this is not a question of unions bankrupting the economy by going into bargaining and asking for wages. This is a question about unions strengthening the economy, particularly at a moment now where there's issues about macroeconomic stability and spending power and the recovery from a recession. We are doing something useful. We are doing employers and the government and the whole economy a favor by linking arms and going in and saying, we have some power and we're negotiating higher wages. We don't have to apologize for that. We don't have to be reticent or embarrassed about that. We should thump our chests about that and say, we are doing a good thing. Here's the breakdown of Australia's GDP. This is where the spending comes from that allows our businesses to operate, and over half of it comes from personal consumption spending, and over half of that comes from wages and salaries. So we are absolutely strengthening the fundamental conditions of the economy, particularly as we recover from a recession. This is always true, what I've described, but it's incredibly true right now as we come out of the COVID pandemic. And we've done some work at our Center for Future Work on the sources of the economic recovery that has been experienced since the worst days of the lockdowns last spring. So the GDP is measured on a quarterly basis. So if we take the June quarter last year as the low point of the economy, and then go to the most recent data that we have, which is for the December quarter, this is how far the economy recovered in the second half of 2020. And Australia did well, mostly because we controlled the COVID well. Because community contagion was limited, businesses could reopen much faster than in other parts of the world, including in Canada, where I'm speaking from. But the main source of that new demand was consumers. Look at that. 96% of all the new demand that helped Australia's economy start to climb back from the recession came from consumer spending. And you saw it, right? People were thrilled to get out. When the stores opened again and the cafes and restaurants and pubs opened again, people were thrilled to get out. Some of them had savings. Some of them had accumulated unmet demand during those terrible months of the pandemic. And they went out and spent that money. And it's a good thing, because that is the only thing that actually helped Australia's economy carry on. And what's more, that's not ancient history anymore. That was last year. This is what the government's forecasting for next year. They just issued their own budget, the Commonwealth budget, a couple of weeks ago, and they're expecting that continued strong growth in consumer demand is going to account for the lion's share of total growth over the next year as well. Government itself, they think, will contribute a bit more in terms of government services and infrastructure spending and so on, but most of the weight, most of the heavy lifting is still being done by the Australian consumer. So the Australian consumer better have some money in their pocket if they're going to do this job. And here's the contradiction in the government strategy. They're counting on consumers to keep spending like there's no tomorrow in order to power the economy out of the recession. But they're complacent about the fact that wages have been growing at their slowest pace in Australia's post-war history. Already, for the better part of a decade, we have seen wage growth stuck around 2% a year, whereas it should be growing at 3 or 4% a year or even more. And that's not an accident. That was deliberate government policy to try and suppress wages through all kinds of measures, including wage caps on public servants, attacks on unions and collective bargaining, changes to labor law to make it easier for employers to hire casual workers and others who have no bargaining power. So instead of doing something about that, they're tolerating it, and they haven't acknowledged that you cannot expect wages to keep growing to 2% or even lower right now. The new data came out yesterday showing it was down to 1.5%, and still expect consumers to have money to spend. It doesn't work. This is Philip Lowe. He's the governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, not usually a radical Bolshevik by any stretch of the imagination. And he's chewing his nails here because he's nervous as hell about meeting his future inflation forecasts and the fact that prices and wages are growing too slow. Even he has come out and said wages have to grow a lot faster. He does the math this way. His job is to meet a 2.5% inflation target. He hasn't met that in years. He's been below every single year. In order to do that, you need to see wages growing about 3.5% a year, because from that, you're going to deduct about 1% a year for ongoing productivity growth. So unit prices to grow at 2.5%, that's where the inflation comes from, have to be supported by wage increases of 3.5%. So, you know, in all due respect, you can sit down at the bargaining table with the employer and say, Philip Lowe, Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, wants us to demand a 3.5% annual wage increase, and you'll have him on your side. You know, you should even go higher, because I know how bargaining works. You have to aim high to get something that you're happy with. Pigs are flying, literally, when the Governor of the Reserve Bank, who is charged with trying to control inflation, is coming out and saying, please, we want wages to grow faster. So in this regard, again, unions are doing a positive function by trying to do exactly that. We are trying to restore inflation to the level that it's supposed to be at. We're trying to build consumer spending power. We're trying to help the government meet its own budget targets. And don't talk to us about messing up the economy. We're one of the forces that are saving the economy. This can't happen without unions. And the reason unions are so essential is because there's an ingrained asymmetry in the employment relationship. Workers and employers need each other, and we're always told by the employer that we're one big happy family and we should work together and stop arguing so much, blah, 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 blah. Okay, it is true we need each other, but we need each other in different ways. Individual workers need their job, because without it, how could they support themselves and their families? And in the extreme, when you've got starvation level job seeker payments and a very weak safety net, in the extreme, people have to work or they're going to starve. So they really need a job. Employers need the workforce in aggregate, because nothing would happen without the workforce. We're the ones who do the work. That was the whole point of that thing at the beginning of the presentation. But they rarely need any particular worker. And contrary to all of the self-help literature that says, you know, you're all unique, you're all important as individuals, in the employer's eyes, almost all of you can be replaced. And in that regard, you have a fundamental asymmetry in bargaining power, where you need the job more than the employer needs you. So if you think you're going to be able to sit down one-on-one and negotiate a fair deal that gets wages growing at that 3.5% target and gives you a share of the productivity gains that your labor helps to produce, you're dreaming, okay? It's not going to happen. This is where unions and the collective bargaining process come in. It is the way that we balance off that asymmetry in power that is inherent in the employment relationship. It's the way that workers can impose a cost of disagreement on the employer that is more than saying, I quit, in which case the boss says, okay, I'll replace you. That's not much of a cost of disagreement. But when workers go together, then this is when genuine bargaining can happen. And it didn't take workers long in the history of the industrial economy to figure this out. In the early sweatshops, workers were, you know, paid literally starvation wages, and they worked 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. And they realized if they got together, and getting together was the only way, they could force those sweatshop owners to share the wealth a bit more. And that's why employers and employer-friendly governments have always tried to break unions, to suppress unions, to police unions. And Australia's government, of course, is very good at that. In fact, I've worked in labor economics around the world through my career, and I've never seen a place that micromanages and polices industrial relations more with more scrutiny than in Australia. It's a very odd and very counterproductive system in that regard. But we have to do what we can with the power that we have, and that means sitting down in collective bargaining with the support of your members and trying to get wages up to that 3.5% or even higher. And the reality is, no society in history has achieved inclusive prosperity where the average person has a share of the wealth and a bit of security and can send their kids to university. That has never happened without unions and collective bargaining to offset that inherent asymmetry and get to a situation where we have a chance to negotiate something that's fair and sustainable. So in this regard, unions play an essential and positive and legitimate economic function. We are not outlaws, we are not bikies, we are not thugs, we are playing a role in society that society needs. Because without our bargaining power, without the process that you and your members are about to enter, wages would tend to fall and fall and fall towards the minimum subsistence level, where the employer can find the most desperate person to come in and do that job. And you want to see what where it gets to, go out and look at the poor kids and students delivering fast food on their bicycles and not even making minimum wage. That is where you get to in the end, without some kind of collective power to establish benchmarks and minimums and negotiate with employers to share the wealth. And if we can explain that, not just to our members so that they understand why they have to join the union and why they have to support the union in bargaining, but explain it to the public, then the social license, if you like, of the union movement will be solidified and people will understand we're playing this role. We can imagine a much better, fairer, stronger economy than the one that we've got today. And because the economy starts with work as the driving force, then getting there means doing more work and doing work better and making jobs better, so that we produce more output and we generate more income and we pay more taxes, by the way. And we're glad to pay more taxes when our income is rising. And then we use that wealth to lift living standards and strengthen our communities and protect the environment. And having a collective voice and collective power for unions is a precondition for that to happen. We are doing something that's good and valuable and essential. And use that as you walk in and take a deep breath and sit down at that table and start telling the employer why they need to give you a better offer. And when you do that, you're literally on the side of the economic angels. So I'll leave it at that. I thank you for what you're doing as trade unionists to try and lift that miserable level of wage growth that's holding Australia's economy back. And I look forward to any questions, discussion that we've got time for. Thank you.